The sun was setting over Los Angeles, casting a warm golden glow over the magnificent crystal ballroom of the Beverly Hills Hotel. It was 6:30 p.m. on a pleasant Saturday evening, and the annual Los Angeles Community Foundation fundraiser was about to become more memorable than anyone could have expected. The ballroom sparkled with elegant decorations, featuring crystal chandeliers that threw rainbow patterns across the walls. Round tables covered in crisp white tablecloths dotted the room, each one perfectly set with fine china and fresh flower centerpieces. At the front of the room, a large banner read Building Future Leaders, Annual Youth Education Fundraiser 2025. Snoop Dogg arrived exactly on time, dressed in a perfectly tailored dark blue suit that made him stand out from the usual black tie crowd. His hair was neatly styled, and a pair of designer sunglasses hung from his breast pocket. As he walked in, many people noticed that he wasn't surrounded by the usual entourage of bodyguards and assistants. Instead, he carried himself with a quiet confidence that came from decades of experience in the spotlight. The event coordinator, Sarah Chen, rushed over to greet him with a warm smile. She was a young woman in her early 30s who had spent months organizing this fundraiser. "Mr. Brodus," she said professionally, using his real name, "we're so grateful you could make it tonight. The kids from the South Central after-school program are especially excited to meet you." Snoop smiled back, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "Thank you for having me," he replied, his voice carrying its familiar laid-back tone. "And please, call me Snoop. We're all family here." The ballroom was filling up quickly. Local business owners chatted with city council members, while teachers from underfunded schools mixed with wealthy donors. Everyone was here for one purpose: to support youth education programs in Los Angeles's most challenging neighborhoods. Near the stage, a group of teenagers from the South Central after-school music program were setting up their instruments. They were going to perform later in the evening, and their nervous excitement was visible in their quick movements and whispered conversations. Snoop watched them with particular interest. He had been secretly mentoring these kids for the past 6 months. As more guests arrived, the atmosphere grew livelier. The smell of gourmet food wafted from the kitchen, where chefs were preparing a menu that mixed high-end cuisine with comfort food classics. Servers moved smoothly through the crowd with trays of appetizers, while a jazz quartet played softly in the corner. What made this fundraiser different from others was its focus on bringing together people from all parts of the city. There were tables where millionaire executives sat next to single mothers who benefited from the foundation's programs. Former gang members who now ran youth outreach programs chatted with police officers about community initiatives. Snoop moved through the room easily, stopping to shake hands and take photos with anyone who asked. He listened intently as parents told him about their children's dreams, and he shared stories about his own journey from the streets of Long Beach to international stardom. But he always brought the conversation back to the importance of education and community support. At one point, he stopped to talk with Marcus, a 15-year-old boy from the music program. Marcus was nervous at first, but Snoop's friendly manner soon had him relaxing. "You know what's cool about music?" Snoop asked the teenager. "It doesn't care where you come from or what you look like. It just cares about what's in your heart." As the evening progressed, the energy in the room continued to build. People were excited about the upcoming presentations and performances, but they were especially looking forward to Snoop's speech and his promised donation announcement. What they didn't know was that he had prepared something special, a donation that would change thousands of young lives. The foundation's director, Dr. Patricia Williams, approached the stage to begin the formal part of the evening. The room quieted down as she tapped the microphone, and Snoop took his seat at a front table. He pulled out his phone to review his speech one last time, unaware that in just a few minutes, this peaceful fundraiser would turn into something none of them expected. Dr. Williams had just finished introducing the evening's first speaker when Karen Wilson made her entrance. She was 55 years old, wearing an expensive designer dress and enough diamonds to buy a small car. She arrived 40 minutes late, making sure everyone noticed as she clicked across the marble floor in her red-bottomed heels. Karen Wilson wasn't just any donor. She was old money, the kind that came from generations of wealth and privilege. Her family had donated to the foundation for years, though mostly for the tax benefits and social status it brought them. Today, she had already had 3 glasses of champagne at another event, and it showed in her flushed cheeks and overly loud voice. The first sign of trouble came when she saw the seating arrangement. The foundation had deliberately mixed tables to bring different community members together. Karen found herself seated next to a young black teacher from South Central and across from a Hispanic small business owner. Her lips tightened into a thin line as she remained standing, scanning the room with obvious disapproval. Snoop was still at his table, having just finished a conversation with one of the teenage performers. He was writing something in the young musician's notebook, advice about chord progressions and life in general. The boy's eyes were bright with excitement as Snoop explained how music could open doors that seemed forever closed. That's when Karen spotted him. Her face changed from general disapproval to something darker. She had seen Snoop's name on the donor list, but had convinced herself it was a different person. Now, seeing him here, in what she considered her social circle, something seemed to snap. "Excuse me," she said loudly, her voice cutting through the gentle murmur of conversation. "I need to speak to whoever's in charge of this event." The way she said event made it sound like something she found stuck to her shoe. Sarah Chen, the event coordinator, approached quickly. "Mrs. Wilson, how can I help you?" she asked professionally, though she already sensed what was coming. She had dealt with Karen's complaints at previous events. "When did this become a celebrity charity?" Karen's voice grew louder. "This used to be a respectable foundation. Now look at it, you've turned it into some kind of hip-hop party." People nearby began to notice. Some pulled out their phones, sensing drama was about to unfold. Others looked embarrassed, wanting to stop what was happening but unsure how. Snoop had finished with the young musician and was now making his way toward the stage. He needed to prepare for his presentation about the new music education program he was funding. That's when Karen deliberately stepped into his path, positioning herself right in front of him. "I've been a member of this foundation's board for 20 years, she announced, loud enough for nearby tables to hear. Her voice was shaking, but not from fear, from what she thought was righteous anger. 20 years of maintaining certain standards. Snoop stopped, keeping a calm expression on his face. He dealt with people like Karen before, and experience had taught him that his response in the next few moments would be crucial. The security team, led by a man named James, started moving through the crowd. They could see trouble brewing, but Snoop gave them a small hand signal to wait. He wanted to handle this his own way. The room grew quieter as more people noticed what was happening. The teenage musicians stopped their practice. The servers paused with their trays. Even the jazz quartet slowly faded their music to silence. Karen took the quiet as encouragement. She stood straighter, lifted her chin, and looked directly at Snoop. "This foundation was built by respectable people," she said, emphasizing each word. "Real Americans who built this country, not people who just showed up and started making demands." Dr. Williams was already moving toward them, but Karen was on a roll now. Years of hidden thoughts were spilling out, fueled by champagne and entitlement. She looked Snoop up and down, taking in his expensive suit with a sneer. "If you don't like how we do things here," she said, her voice dripping with disdain, "you can just go back to Africa." The silence that followed was absolute. Someone gasped. Phones were recording everywhere now. The teenage musician Snoop had been mentoring looked ready to jump to his defense, but Snoop's calm expression never changed. He took a slow, deliberate breath, and everyone waited to see how he would respond to such a blatant display of racism in a place meant to celebrate unity and education. The 5 seconds of silence that followed Karen's racist comment felt like an eternity. The elegant crystal ballroom, with its sparkling chandeliers and perfectly set tables, had become the stage for an ugly display of prejudice that no one had expected at a charity event meant to unite the community. Karen Wilson, encouraged by the shocked silence, decided to continue her rant. Her voice grew louder, echoing off the high ceilings. "Look at what's happening to our nice events," she said, waving her arms dramatically. "I remember when we had proper guests here. Now they're letting in rappers and street people." Several people in the crowd started moving at once. Dr. Patricia Williams, the foundation's director, was quickly walking toward them. Sarah Chen, the event coordinator, was already on her phone, likely calling for backup. The security team, led by James, took several steps forward, but still held back at Snoop's earlier signal. The teenage musicians who had been practicing earlier huddled together near the stage. Marcus, the young boy Snoop had been mentoring, looked close to tears. His hands were balled into fists, and his older sister had her arm around his shoulders, whispering something in his ear. And another thing, Karen continued, her voice getting more shrill with each word. She pointed her finger directly at Snoop's chest. We don't need your kind of money here. Who knows where it came from? Probably drugs or that awful rap music that's destroying our children's minds. Phones were recording everywhere now. At least 30 devices were pointed at the scene, capturing every word. Some people were already streaming it live on social media. In the back of the room, a local news reporter who had been covering the charity event was frantically taking notes. A well-dressed older man, who turned out to be Karen's husband, Thomas Wilson, finally pushed through the crowd. Karen, that's enough, he said firmly, reaching for her arm. His face was red with embarrassment. Let's go home. But Karen yanked her arm away from him. She was too far gone now, years of hidden prejudice spilling out in front of hundreds of witnesses. Don't touch me, Thomas. Someone needs to say these things. Someone needs to stand up for what's right. She turned back to Snoop, her voice rising to almost a screech. You think you can buy respect? You think an expensive suit and some donation makes you belong here? Go back to where you came from. Go back to Africa. Take your gangs and your drugs and your rap music with you. The crowd's reaction was immediate and intense. Several people started shouting back at Karen. A group of donors stood up and began walking toward the exit, making it clear they wanted nothing to do with her behavior. One woman even took off her charity event badge and threw it on the ground in disgust. Dr. Williams finally reached them, stepping between Karen and Snoop. Mrs. Wilson, she said in a stern, professional voice, you need to leave. Now. Leave? Karen laughed, but it wasn't a happy sound. I'm on the board. My family has been part of this foundation for generations. You can't make me leave. That's when an elderly black woman slowly stood up from her table. Everyone recognized her as Mrs. Eleanor Thompson, one of the foundation's original members from the 1960s. She walked with a cane, but her voice was strong and clear as she spoke. Actually, Karen, Mrs. Thompson said, we can. I move for an immediate vote to remove Karen Wilson from the foundation's board. All in favor? Hands shot up all around the room. Even Karen's husband raised his hand, though he couldn't look his wife in the eye as he did so. Karen's face went from red to white as she looked around the room. Her eyes darted from person to person, perhaps finally realizing what she had done. But instead of apologizing, she doubled down. Fine, she shouted, her voice cracking. Remove me, but I'm telling the truth. Everyone here is thinking it. I'm just brave enough to say it. Through all of this, Snoop hadn't moved or changed his expression. He stood calmly, hands relaxed at his sides, watching Karen with what looked almost like sympathy in his eyes. When she finally ran out of words, breathing heavily from her tirade, he slowly reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. The room held its breath, waiting to see how the legendary rapper would respond to such a public and vicious attack. The Crystal Ballroom had transformed from a peaceful charity event into what felt like a courtroom, with hundreds of witnesses watching the scene unfold. The crowd's reaction to Karen's racist outburst came in waves, each more powerful than the last. The first wave was pure shock. People stood frozen, drinks halfway to their lips, forks suspended in midair. The teenage musicians near the stage huddled closer together, their eyes wide. Marcus, the young boy Snoop had been mentoring, was being held back by his sister as tears of anger rolled down his face. Then came the second wave, anger. It started as a low murmur but quickly grew louder. People began speaking up from different corners of the room. How dare she? This is disgusting. Someone get her out of here. Sarah Chen, the event coordinator, was frantically trying to maintain order while speaking into her headset, security to the main floor now. But wait for my signal. She kept glancing at Snoop, who still hadn't moved or changed his calm expression. The third wave was action. People started voting with their feet. At least 30 guests stood up and walked toward the exits, making sure their charity badges were visible as they left. Others pulled out their checkbooks, walking straight to Dr. Williams to make donations in direct protest of Karen's behavior. Mrs. Eleanor Thompson, the elderly foundation member who had called for Karen's removal, was now surrounded by a group of board members. They were having an intense discussion about holding an emergency meeting the next morning. Even from a distance, words like immediate removal and public apology could be heard. The local news reporter, Jenny Martinez, had abandoned her usual professional distance. She was openly recording everything on her phone while speaking rapidly into her dictaphone. In a shocking display of racism at the Los Angeles Community Foundation fundraiser, board member Karen Wilson has just. But the most interesting reactions were coming from Karen. The silence in the crystal ballroom was complete as Snoop Dogg finally began to speak. His voice was calm and clear, carrying easily across the room without needing a microphone. The smile on his face wasn't angry or mocking. It was the kind of smile a teacher might give to a student who needed guidance. You know, he began, looking directly at Karen. My grandfather used to tell me something important when I was growing up in Long Beach. He said, when you meet hatred, you got two choices. You can add more hatred to the world, or you can turn it into a teaching moment. He paused, letting his words sink in. Karen, who had expected anger or aggression, looked confused by his gentle tone. Her hands, which had been balled into fists, slowly relaxed at her sides. So let me tell you about Africa. Snoop continued, his voice warm and engaging. It's a beautiful continent with 54 countries, each with its own rich culture and history. But I've never lived there. I was born right here in Long Beach, California, just like my parents were born in Mississippi. He took a few steps forward, not toward Karen but toward the teenage musicians who were still huddled near the stage. These kids behind me, they're learning about Mozart and Bach, but they're also learning about jazz, hip-hop, and rhythm and blues. That's American music. That's our culture. All of us together. Phones were still recording, but now people were nodding along with his words. Even some of those who had started to leave were coming back into the room. Mrs. Wilson, he said, turning back to Karen, you mentioned my money and where it came from. Let me tell you exactly where it came from. It came from hard work, from touring, making music, building businesses, and creating jobs. But most importantly, it came from a community that believed in me. He gestured around the room. Look at everyone here. Different colors, different backgrounds, different stories, but we're all here for the same reason. We believe in these kids. We believe in their future. Karen's face had lost its anger, replaced by something that looked almost like shame. Her husband, Thomas, had moved closer, ready to lead her away, but Snoop wasn't finished. You told me to go back to Africa, he said, his voice still kind but now carrying a hint of steel. But I'm already home. This is my home. It's your home too. And it's big enough for all of us if we just open our hearts a little. He reached into his suit jacket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. I was going to announce this later, but now seems like the right time. This is a check for $2 million, earmarked specifically for cultural education programs in Los Angeles schools, because I believe the best way to fight ignorance is with knowledge. The room erupted in applause, but Snoop raised his hand for quiet. And Mrs. Wilson, I want to personally invite you to come visit one of these programs once they're running. Come meet the kids. Listen to their stories. Share your story too. Because that's how we grow, together. Marcus, the young musician Snoop had been mentoring, stepped forward from the group by the stage. His voice shook slightly, but his words were clear. Mr. Snoop taught us that music isn't about color. It's about soul. And everybody's got soul. Snoop smiled at the boy, then addressed the room one final time. So here's what we're going to do now. We're going to get back to why we're all here, supporting these amazing kids. Mrs. Wilson, you're welcome to stay and learn with us, or you can leave. The choice is yours. But either way, I want you to know that I forgive you, and I hope one day you'll understand why what you said was wrong. He turned to Dr. Williams. Now, I believe we have some talented young musicians ready to perform, and I think I might just join them for a song about unity and understanding. How does that sound? The crowd's response was immediate and overwhelming. People were wiping tears from their eyes, hugging each other, and breaking into sustained applause. Karen Wilson, her face now streaked with mascara, turned and hurried toward the exit, her husband following close behind. But Snoop's words had transformed an ugly moment into something powerful and healing. As he walked toward the stage, people reached out to shake his hand, pat his back, and thank him for showing them a better way to handle hatred. What happened next at the Crystal Ballroom would be remembered for years to come. Instead of letting Karen Wilson's racist outburst ruin the evening, Snoop Dogg transformed it into something extraordinary. As Karen and her husband disappeared through the exit, Snoop took control of the room in a way that only a veteran performer could. "Everyone, please take your seats," he said, his voice carrying naturally through the space. "Including you," he pointed to those who had started to leave earlier. "Because what just happened here? That's exactly why we're all here tonight." The teenage musicians were still on stage, their instruments ready. Snoop walked up to join them, removing his suit jacket and placing it carefully on a nearby chair. He picked up a spare microphone and turned to the crowd. "Marcus," he called out to his young mentee, "bring your saxophone up here, young man. We're going to show everyone what unity sounds like." As Marcus nervously made his way to the stage, Snoop addressed the room again. "You see, music has always been about bringing people together. Jazz was born when different cultures mixed their sounds. Rock and roll came from blues. Hip-hop? It samples everything because it knows that beauty can come from anywhere." The other young musicians began setting up their instruments with new purpose. Sarah Chen, the event coordinator, quickly adjusted the lighting to create a proper stage effect. The room was completely focused on what was unfolding. "Now some of you might be wondering why I didn't get angry back there," Snoop continued, helping Marcus adjust his saxophone stand. "Let me tell you about something that happened to me when I was about Marcus's age." He sat on the edge of the stage, feet dangling, looking more like a storyteller at a family gathering than a global superstar. "I was walking home from school one day when a car full of people started yelling racist things at me. I was angry. I wanted to yell back, but an old jazz player who lived on my street saw what happened and called me over." The crowd was silent, hanging on every word. Even the servers had stopped moving, listening intently. This old man, Mr. Johnson was his name, sat me down and put on a record. It was Duke Ellington playing with white musicians back when that almost never happened. He told me, "Son, when they go low with hatred, you go high with art." Snoop stood up and walked over to the piano. His fingers touched the keys softly as he spoke. "That's what we're going to do right now. These kids have been practicing a special piece. It mixes classical music with hip-hop, jazz with R&B. It's what America really sounds like." He turned to the young musicians. "You ready?" They nodded, nervous but excited. Then he addressed the crowd one more time. "The money I donated tonight, a lot of it is going to programs that teach kids about different cultures. Because hatred comes from fear, and fear comes from not understanding each other. When you learn about someone's music, their art, their stories, it's hard to hate them." The foundation's director, Dr. Williams, stepped forward. "We're going to call it the Unity Through Arts program," she announced. "It will bring together students from all parts of the city to learn about each other's cultural traditions." Snoop nodded approvingly. "And you know what? That lady who just left? I meant what I said about wanting her to visit these programs. Because change is possible. I've seen it. I've lived it." He looked at Marcus and the other young musicians, ready to show them what the future sounds like. What followed was something truly special. The young musicians, led by Snoop, performed a piece that blended Mozart's Ein klein Nachtmusik with a hip-hop beat, while Marcus's saxophone added soulful jazz runs. The combination shouldn't have worked, but it was beautiful. People in the audience began to sway. Some were crying. Others were smiling and nodding to the beat. Mrs. Eleanor Thompson, the elderly foundation member, was tapping her cane in time with the music. Near the back of the room, the local reporter, Jenny Martinez, was still recording, but now she was also wiping tears from her eyes. Her phone showed that the live stream had over 100,000 viewers, all watching as hatred was transformed into harmony. By the end of the performance, everyone in the room understood that they had witnessed something more than just a response to racism. They had seen a masterclass in turning darkness into light, in using art to bridge divides, and in the power of responding to hatred with love and wisdom. Outside the Crystal Ballroom, Karen Wilson's world was falling apart. She stood in the hotel's marble hallway, her designer heels clicking against the floor as she paced back and forth. Her husband Thomas kept trying to get her to leave, but she couldn't seem to make herself walk to the exit. "My phone," she said, her voice shaking as she looked at her screen. "It's already on Twitter, Facebook, everything. There are thousands of comments." Her perfectly made-up face was streaked with tears, her mascara leaving black trails down her cheeks. Thomas Wilson was on his third phone call with their family lawyer. "Yes, she understands how serious this is," he was saying, his face red with stress. "Just tell us what we need to do to fix this." But there was no easy fix. Hotel guests were walking past, pointing and whispering. Some were taking pictures. A group of young people in the lobby were watching the live stream of what was still happening inside the ballroom. Their phones turned up loud enough that Karen could hear Snoop's voice talking about unity and understanding. "I'm ruined," Karen whispered, sliding down to sit on a nearby bench. "Everything we built. Our reputation. The family name." Her hands were shaking so badly she dropped her phone, and it clattered across the marble floor. Inside the ballroom, the sound of music and applause could be heard through the thick doors. The very event she had tried to disrupt was continuing successfully without her. Even worse, it had become more meaningful because of her actions, but not in the way she had intended. A hotel security guard approached them. "Mr. and Mrs. Wilson, your car is ready at the side entrance. We think it would be best if you left through there. There are some media vehicles arriving at the main entrance." Thomas helped Karen to her feet. She looked small now, nothing like the proud, angry woman who had confronted Snoop Dogg just minutes ago. As they walked toward the side exit, her phone kept buzzing with notifications. "Foundation Board emergency meeting, tomorrow 8 a.m. Membership suspended. Effective immediately. Country Club Board review notice. Message from Children's Hospital Board of Directors." Each notification represented another piece of her social world crumbling. The charity boards, the social clubs, the prestigious positions she had spent years building, they were all slipping away in real time. As they waited for the elevator to the parking level, a young black woman in a hotel uniform held the door open for them. Karen couldn't meet her eyes. Just an hour ago, she might have ignored this worker completely. Now she felt ashamed just being in her presence. "Thomas," she said quietly as they rode down, "what have I done?" Her husband didn't answer. He was still on the phone, now talking to their children's publicist. Their daughter was a rising social media influencer, and their son was running for local office. Both would need to release statements distancing themselves from their mother's actions. The hotel's side exit led to a quiet street where their black Mercedes waited. Their regular driver, James, who had worked for them for 15 years and was himself a black man, stood by the car door. He opened it without a word, his face carefully blank. As Karen slid into the back seat, she could hear distant cheering from the ballroom above. Someone had opened the windows, and the sound of music, classical mixed with hip-hop, floated down to the street. It was beautiful, and that somehow made everything worse. Her phone buzzed one final time. It was a message from her best friend of 20 years. "Please lose my number. I can't be associated with this." Thomas got in beside her, finally off his phone. "The lawyer says to say nothing. Don't post anything. Don't respond to anyone. We need to go home and wait for this to blow over." But they both knew this wouldn't just blow over. As James pulled the car away from the hotel, Karen caught a glimpse of her reflection in the window. She barely recognized herself. The perfectly put-together socialite was gone, replaced by someone who looked lost and afraid. Back inside the hotel, the basement staff break room was buzzing with excitement. The kitchen workers, housekeepers, and maintenance staff were all watching the live stream on their phones, cheering as Snoop and the young musicians played. Several were recording messages to share with their families. "See? Sometimes justice happens right in front of you." As the Mercedes disappeared into the Los Angeles night, Karen Wilson finally understood something. She hadn't just ruined an evening or damaged her reputation. She had revealed her true self to the world, and the world had responded by showing her a better way to be, even if she might be too late to learn from it. 1 month after the incident at the Crystal Ballroom, the Los Angeles Community Foundation held another event. This time, it was the official launch of the Unity Through Arts program, and the ballroom was even more crowded than before. The story of what had happened that night had touched millions of people around the world. The viral video of Karen Wilson's racist outburst and Snoop's peaceful response had reached over 50 million views. But it wasn't the conflict that people kept sharing, it was what happened afterward. The video of the young musicians playing their classical hip-hop fusion piece had inspired similar programs across the country. Marcus, the young saxophone player, stood on the same stage where everything had happened. But now he wasn't nervous, he was confident. He spoke into the microphone, addressing a room full of educators, students, and community leaders. "A month ago, I learned something important from Mr. Snoop," he said, his voice clear and strong. I learned that music isn't just about playing notes. It's about building bridges between people. And now, thanks to the Unity Through Arts program, hundreds of other kids will learn the same thing. The program had already exceeded everyone's expectations. Snoop's initial $2 million donation had sparked a wave of giving. Other celebrities and business leaders, moved by what they had seen, had contributed another $8 million. The foundation now had enough money to run arts programs in every public school in Los Angeles. Dr. Williams walked to the podium, holding up a thick stack of papers. "These are applications from other cities wanting to start similar programs," she announced. "New York, Chicago, Atlanta, Miami. They'd all want to copy what we're doing here." They saw how one moment of hatred was transformed into a movement of understanding. The local news reporter, Jenny Martinez, who had live-streamed the original incident, was now working on a documentary about the program. Her cameras followed students as they learned about different musical traditions, watching them discover how every culture had something valuable to teach. "The most amazing thing," Jenny said in her latest report, "is how this program brings families together. Parents who never talk to each other are now sitting side by side, watching their children perform music that blends all their traditions." In the month since the incident, other things had changed too. Karen Wilson had finally done something unexpected. She had checked herself into therapy to confront her prejudices. Her public apology letter, published in the Los Angeles Times, was honest and humble. "I was wrong," she had written. "Not just that night, but in the way I've thought about people different from me. I'm grateful to Snoop Dogg for showing me a better way, even though I didn't deserve his kindness. I'm now doing the hard work of changing, and I hope someday to be worthy of forgiveness." The foundation had received thousands of letters from people sharing their own stories of confronting racism. Many wrote about how Snoop's response had taught them a new way to handle hatred. Teachers showed the video in their classrooms, using it to start important conversations about respect and understanding. But perhaps the most meaningful change could be seen in the young musicians themselves. The group that had performed with Snoop that night now called themselves the Unity Band. They played at schools across the city, showing other kids how different styles of music could work together. "When I play Mozart mixed with hip-hop," Marcus explained to a group of younger students, "I'm not just making music. I'm showing people that beautiful things happen when we bring different worlds together." Today's event was extra special because Snoop had returned to see how the program was growing. He sat quietly in the back of the room, watching as Marcus and the Unity Band performed their newest piece, a blend of classical, jazz, hip-hop, and traditional music from 5 different cultures. As the music filled the room, Snoop smiled, thinking about how one ugly moment had led to something so beautiful. The foundation's new slogan, painted on a banner above the stage, said it all: "Music builds bridges, understanding breaks barriers." The last person to arrive at the event was a surprise: Karen Wilson. She sat in the very back row, listening to the music with tears in her eyes. When Marcus finished playing, she was the first to stand and applaud. She didn't say anything or try to draw attention to herself. She just listened and learned, exactly as Snoop had hoped she would that night 1 month ago. The Crystal Ballroom, which had witnessed both the worst and best of human nature that night, had become a symbol of change. It wasn't just a place for fancy parties anymore. It was where people learned that the best response to hatred wasn't more hatred, but patience, wisdom, and the universal language of music.